Hello and welcome to Projector, and on this episode, two friends go in search of the rave of their lives in the Scottish film Beats, executive produced by Steven Soderbergh. In 1994, Jono, played by Christian Ortega, and Spanner, played by Lorne MacDonald, are two best friends in a small Scottish town who share a passion for dance music. But their world is changing. Jono is about to move to a new home, and the government is about to introduce the Criminal Justice and Public Order Bill, which includes plans to outlaw gatherings around music wholly or predominantly based around repetitive beats to tackle illegal raves. When Jono and Spanner hear of a protest rave called Revolt, they go on one last adventure together before they're forced apart. Beats is based very loosely on a one-man stage show by Kieran Hurley, which is essentially him reading accounts of people in the rave scene at the time of the Criminal Justice and Public Order Bill, an extremely extensive piece of mid-90s UK legislation that covered a number of different areas. Film fans may have heard of it because it tightened up video classification and censorship at the time, paying particular attention to potential harm on viewers, especially those who were underage. Director Brian Welsh saw Hurley's play, and together they've adapted it into a new fictionalised tale for the screen. Welsh is best known as a television director, including most notably the episode Black Mirror, The Complete History of You. You know, the one where everyone is recording things with their eyes. You remember that one? He directed it. And his work impressed Steven Soderbergh, and they struck up a friendship. That explains his executive producer credit on this movie. He used his clout as a way of getting it financed. He essentially served as a mentor figure to Welsh and just helped get this story to the screen. Confusingly, this isn't the only 2019 film called Beats. In fact, just the very week that I record this, Netflix has released another movie called Beats, which is totally unrelated and not annoying in the slightest, because presumably when this film gets a US release, they're going to have to change the title. Now, I've heard of two films sharing the same name. I've even seen it happen within the same year, but I've never seen it occur within a month of each other. That's ridiculous. Now, for the purpose of this video, I did actually watch the Netflix Beats, which stars Anthony Anderson and Khalil Everidge, and it's a perfectly acceptable musical drama that deals with themes of trauma and PTSD and inner city violence in Southside Chicago and trying to rise above that fear. It's a little bit cliched and very formulaic. It's not especially remarkable. You can understand why that film is premiering on Netflix. There's also the fact that I think that Anthony Anderson's character in that movie is not especially likeable, nor the beats in that film actually all that good, considering they're a major plot point. This is essentially a very long-winded way of saying the Scottish film is much better than the Netflix one. I have to admit I went into the Scottish Beats not really knowing very much about it or having any kind of expectations, or even though it would hold my interest. A movie set in the Scottish rave scene in the mid-90s didn't sound like it would be up my alley. I am the last person you like to find down the club. Anything to do with loud music is not my idea of a good time. And yet, underneath that surface, Beats deeply resonated with me, and that's because, unexpectedly, it's actually a film about friendship, not necessarily about music, and it's deeply rooted in the coming-of-age story, which is told with a very unique flavour this time out. So you've got these two lads who have both come from impoverished backgrounds who have united over their shared love of this kind of music. It provides an escapism. And Christian Ortega and Lorne MacDonald are fantastic in the lead roles. They're both relative newcomers, but they're so natural on screen. You totally believe them in their friendship, and a lot of this movie is simply them hanging around with each other, and you can tell how close that bond is, and it's really relatable, especially if you grew up in that particular point in time. There's a moment where Spanner mentions how he was staying up waiting for a song to be played again on the radio that he heard a couple of days before because he wanted to get it on tape. That alone film should spur a couple of memories for people of way back when. But like in many stories like this, the world is pulling them apart. They're from two slightly different worlds. Jono, his family, is moving up. He's moving out. In fact, he's going to a new neighborhood that's more affluent, and his family don't support him in seeing Spanner. They see Spanner and where he comes from as being this negative influence, which we know is not true, but because we see where Spanner comes from, and he lives with his abusive brother who is constantly picking on him, and occasionally is very violent. Spanner's brother aspires to be a drug dealer. You can understand them trying to disassociate from as much as possible. And yeah, Spanner is reckless, and he's a little bit aimless and directionless, but he is intelligent, and he really does care for Jono. There is a genuine connection there that really is very touching over the course of the film. These are clearly two people that would go to bat for each other. If you've ever had a friend that you've lost track of over the years, and sort of just been separated by various circumstances, you'll recognise the dynamic in this film. And it's representative of a world that in itself is changing. It's played against the rave scene that is also dying. This is the last gasp of this particular era before it moved inside into actual clubs and it became commercialised. And so there is a double poignancy there. There is definitely a sense that these characters are moving from being kids to being adults. There's also the fact that Jono has got himself a job working in a supermarket that he absolutely hates. It's a symbol of conformity, but also the fact that he's moving into responsibility. Whereas Spanner, those options are maybe not as afforded to him. And so Spanner, while he is often very funny, there's also something quite tragic about him at the same time, the way that he's ignored and neglected on the basis of his brother. And so when he's presented with the opportunity to have one last glorious day with his friend, he seizes it, even though it's a massive risk. He steals his brother's drug money and uses it to fund their time together, even though he knows that once his brother finds out, he will bring his wrath upon him, and that could mean even death. He doesn't know if his brother might actually go that far, and whilst that provides an underlying threat to the proceedings, there's also the fact that Spanner doesn't really care. He just wants to have a really good time. And McDonald's performance is really affecting. It reminded me of Ewan Bremner's great performances in things like Trainspotting early on in his career, which I suppose on a surface level you could compare this film to, considering that it's Scottish and set in the 90s, but otherwise totally dissimilar. But a good example of just how great McDonald's performance is the moment where he's pleading, tears in eyes, for Jono to come with him to the illegal rave, even though they both know that they're going to get in trouble for it. And yet, they decide to do so anyway. It's a great testament to the power of a bond between two people. The movie also has a very distinct visual look about it. The majority of it is in black and white, but selectively in colour. For example, the Polaroids that bookend the film are presented in full colour. There's also a later sequence that goes into full colour, and we'll talk about that a bit later. But for the most part, the majority of the colour in the film is red LED lights that you see on various cassette decks and radios and boom boxes that the characters use, and the meaning for that is very clear. It's because music is the most lively, vivid part of their lives, and Brian Welch has mentioned how the black and white look of the film is meant to evoke a certain sense of faded memory, that certain sense of nostalgia of way back when, and it certainly works on that front. He also mentioned that the use of colour in this film is influenced by Francis Ford Coppola's Rumblefish. If you've ever seen that movie, that is also predominantly monochrome but has certain elements in the image in colour. There's a particularly particularly striking shot in Rumblefish, where you have the goldfish in full colour underwater. I always remember that image. Its use of it in Beats is a lot more subtle, but the fact that it's harking back to Rumblefish again reiterates this movie's basis in coming-of-age tropes. But for me, the black and white look of the film further reiterated the kind of poverty that the characters also inhabited. And so, in that sense, it reminded me a lot of Shane Meadows' Summerstown, which if you've ever seen, that also is in black and white for almost the majority of the movie before it finally snaps into full colour. And this combines with the film's political message that is running as an undercurrent. We see it at certain points, particularly when Tony Blair pops up on a TV screen, and there is this sense that the times are changing, this sense of upwards mobility for certain people. And Jono in particular will benefit from that because his mother has fallen in love with a police officer who represents authority over the course of the narrative. That's the reason why they're moving, and yet politically at the same time, you've also got this very oppressive, very conservative bill that punishes young people the hardest. It was ostensibly meant to tackle drug use within the rave scene, but it did so in a very heavy-handed way. And so these characters, they're already on the fringes of society, they're already marginalised, they're being pushed further underground. You frequently see them in disused spaces hanging out. And while the film doesn't pretend there wasn't unsavoury elements, particularly those related to drug dealers, you've got characters connected to Spanner's brother that serve as villains, most of the people in the rave scene that we do meet over the course of Beat are actually quite hippie-like. They're rebelling against the system in their own way, but mostly they just want to get high and listen to their music. They're not really a threat to society. In fact, more accurately, they're probably just a threat to themselves. There's a very funny scene in this film where one character gets high while he's driving up the motorway to get to the rave, while the rest of the passengers are panicking over who the hell is going to drive them there now. There is definitely a real affection presented to the scene in this film, and you're always clear where its sympathies really lie. The movie saves its most unorthodox moment for when we finally get to the rave, and at that point it becomes a full-fledged drug trip. The rave sequence in this film is like the 2001 A Space Odyssey of rave sequences, and I can understand exactly why they've done this. How do you visualise that communal experience that this brings without it being a bunch of people dancing to pulsating music for several minutes on end? Admittedly, I quite like the soundtrack to this movie. I think it's actually quite addictive in its own way, but nevertheless, that's not very visually inspiring. So that's exactly what they've done. They visualised it. We are experiencing this rave through Jono's mind, and he's sort of tripping out and he's hallucinating, and we experience it as this kind of just vibrant collage. The movie snaps into garish colour at this particular point, and it's various patterns cross-cutting or overlaid onto each other, mixed in with stock footage of buildings collapsing or demolishing and various other things, and this goes on for several minutes. It's a big leap. The movie just goes completely abstract at the climax, and I think it does give you a sense of what it's like to be in that kind of environment on a visual level. It's very visceral and kinetic. At the same time, though, I can understand that very distancing audiences. Like I said, this sequence goes on for quite a long time. I can imagine that some people might grow frustrated with that in some way. And also, if you suffer from epilepsy, I'm afraid you should not go see this movie under any circumstance. This sequence will almost certainly set off that condition. It is a very, very strong sequence that goes on for such a lengthy portion of the film. I can't advise you to go and see it under those circumstances, unfortunately. In fact, even though I don't suffer from epilepsy, I still thought, blimey, this could be potentially headache-inducing. It's kind of like watching a Windows Media Player visualization go on screen for several minutes, although that's a little bit of a reductive comparison. I do think the third act of this movie, and the ending in particular, is a little bit weaker than the rest of the movie, in part because of that rave sequence, but also because some of the storylines that are set up over the course of the film aren't satisfyingly resolved. In particular, I'm thinking of Spanner's brother. You think it's building towards a confrontation between those two. They're going to catch up to him at some point, and Spanner's going to have to learn to either stand up for himself or face the music, and instead it's kind of left hanging at the end of the movie. It peters out, unfortunately, which, considering the level of threat that Spanner's brother has in his scenes, that's disappointing. I would have hoped that would amount to more. However, the final scenes of the movie between Jono and Spanner in Jono's bedroom are really quite touching and really quite bittersweet in their own way. And speaking of bittersweet, this movie has the best example of closing text epilogue I think I've ever seen. You know, those "where are they nows?" Seeing the fates of each of these individual characters, in some cases it can be really quite heartbreaking, but the fates of the characters, they often make sense. They feel like they're rooted in reality, which makes it all the more poignant to see. While Beats seems niche at first glance, I actually found it to be surprisingly accessible, and I really enjoyed it quite a bit. I think it's a fresh, imaginative take on the coming-of-age story. You've never seen one quite like this before. I do think it's a little bit of a shame that this movie carries an 18 certificate. It carries that purely on the basis of very strong language. Reason being is this film has around 30 uses of the C word, which, you know, they're Scottish, they use it quite a lot. But nevertheless, the BBFC, rules being rules, this film has an 18 purely because of that, which is such a pity, because I think that younger teenagers would actually get quite a bit out of this film. I think that they will connect with the characters in it, and frankly, I'd much rather that they'd see something like this than some of the films that have been passed in the 15 category with some very strong moments of violence. I think that really seems a little bit hypocritical to give a movie a 15 for really gory moments and then give an 18 certificate purely on the basis of a word being used too many times. I think that's a little bit of a strange argument. Nevertheless, I think that most viewers will find something to adore here, especially if you were in the rave scene at that particular point in time. I think it will definitely stir up fond memories. Beats is a track that's definitely worth listening out for. Beats, the Scottish one, not the Netflix one, is an unexpected surprise of a film packed with youthful energy and rebellion. Despite being set in a very particular place and moment in time, the film's core theme of friendship feels oddly universal, in large part because of the natural energy between Christian Ortega and Lorne MacDonald that gives it its bittersweet thrust. The movie's largely monochrome photography is very striking, not only selling the sense of distant memory, but also the hardship of the world that its characters inhabit. Although Beats' ending doesn't quite resolve all the plot lines in a satisfying way, and the extremely experimental and kaleidoscopic rave sequence may alienate audiences, especially those with epilepsy who should avoid this movie at all costs, this is a lively and distinct take on the coming-of-age story with a banging soundtrack. If you like this review, then you can rave to the grave over at my Patreon, where you can see my reviews early among other perks, including access to my Discord server. But until next time, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.